Hello everyone, welcome. My name is Kate Tawney and I'm the chair of the Wheeler Centre, and it's lovely to welcome you here tonight. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land. And just look out behind me. I think it's so special to be here on the banks of the Birrarung, a place of mist and shadows and a dreaming path which holds such strong spiritual connection. And how lucky we are to benefit from the knowledge shared over thousands of years by the world's oldest storytelling culture. I acknowledge any First Nations people with us tonight, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging. Well, welcome to Spring Fling, a festival of ideas which encourages us to go above and beyond. Spring Fling is proudly supported by the Victorian Government through Creative Victoria and through the City of Melbourne Revitalisation Fund. A special thanks to our bookseller readings. There's a table up the back, and I encourage you to make your purchases because these events are really not possible without the support of people like you who love buying books. And a thank you to the Storytellers, our accommodation partner. We could not do this without you. Well, it's my great pleasure tonight to introduce this event because I get a chance to thank and welcome my friend and former colleague, Leigh Sales. Leigh and I, along with Virginia Trioli, who's here tonight too, worked at the ABC together for many, many years. Leigh has had a stellar career in journalism. She is thoughtful, endlessly curious. She is exacting, determined, and very, very funny. She's no pressure tonight, but we want some laughs as well. She's the presenter of the Australian Story and the recent host of the ABC's flagship current affairs program 7:30, which she hosted for 12 years. She's interviewed dozens of world leaders and celebrities, but perhaps I think most importantly, she's shared and she's shaped hundreds and maybe thousands of stories that have informed, evoked, entertained, moved and challenged us. Leigh is the winner of 3 Walkley Awards, but importantly, she is, of course, a Gold Logie nominee. Responding to that news earlier this year, Leigh said, "It's not lost on me that I currently have the least amount of time on television ever. The less the Australian public sees of me, the more popular I become." And of course, she's the co-host of the fabulous podcast Chat 10 Looks 3 with Annabel Crabb. Leigh's the author of 5 books. The latest Storytellers, Questions, Answers and the Craft of Journalism we'll focus on tonight. And of course, it's available for purchase. And tonight, Leigh is in conversation with Elias Cluer. Elias is a reporter for ABC 7:30 and is based in Melbourne. Since joining the ABC, Elias has worked as a multi-platform reporter in Melbourne, Darwin and Canberra. And Elias has worked at Four Corners and in radio current affairs at the ABC. And prior to joining the national broadcaster, Elias worked as a producer in commercial radio. Please join me in welcoming Leigh and Elias.
Thank you so much, Kate. And Kate was too humble to say, but she was the director of ABC News who actually gave me the job anchoring 7:30, so I owe Kate a great deal. Now, how we're going to work tonight is I'll speak for a little while, and then I'm going to invite Elias to come up, and then we'll expand on some of the themes that I'm talking about in a conversation. So, every single one of us here, by fact of being a human, is a storyteller. And journalists like me are professional storytellers, and many people, though, need top-notch communication skills in their jobs. But whether you are a professional communicator or not, you are still, in your everyday life, a storyteller. Giving order to the world around us and making sense of it through storytelling is the way that we connect to each other, and as Kate points out, that goes back hundreds of thousands of years. And that's be it telling your partner what happened at work or chatting to a neighbour over the fence. When we write a Facebook post, we're telling a story. When a lawyer tries to persuade a jury, they're telling a story. When an engineer unveils new technology for a client, when a patient consults a doctor, when a pilot explains a flight delay, they are all forms of telling a story. Every single day, every encounter that we have is rich in character, in meaning, in plot, and in narrative. But let's face it, not all of us all the time are that good at it. I'm sure we all know somebody who rambles on and on without getting to a point, or somebody who buries the most interesting part of an anecdote so that you end up going, hang on, what, did you just say the goat was on fire? I remember once reading Helen Garner describe her mother as somebody who would start an anecdote weeks, months, or even years before its correct beginning. And then, of course, there's the person who fancies themselves as a great raconteur, or who's a bit used to being treated as the smartest person in the room, they're kind of windbag who never shuts up. Now, I've spent 30 or so years studying and practicing the art of storytelling, and most of what I've learned has been through watching and learning through observing others, and also through direct instruction. And here's the good news. The basics of good storytelling and being better at communicating with others are things that can definitely be learned. And so what I've done with this new book, Storytellers, is talk to some of the best journalists, camera operators, editors and so forth, interviewers in Australia to find out their trade secrets and what that can teach all of us, whether it's to become a better journalist if you work in the media, or simply just a better communicator and a person better able to connect with others in their everyday life. So let me give you an example of the way that I learned the craft. When I was 21 and a shiny new journalist in Brisbane, I was assigned the Boxing Day sales to cover for the evening ABC TV news bulletin. It's a very common assignment, actually, for the most junior journalist in the newsroom. A cameraman and I navigated the bargain-crazed hordes at Myer, and then we returned to the newsroom where I inserted our tape into a beta cam and watched it in fast forward. And yes, I do appreciate that the only thing that could make that sentence sound more 1994 is a reference to Boys to Men. It's just footage of shoppers, my thinking went as I watched it in fast forward. There's no need to suffer the tedium of watching it in real time. Dave English, a gruff ex-newspaper man with a bald head and a white goatee, was the line-up producer that day. That's the senior journalist in charge of ordering the bulletin and editing the reporters' scripts and putting the news to air. He was known for his wit and his economy with words, along with an intolerance of fools and time wasters. And as I watched my material on high speed, Dave marched over and he smacked the toggle on the tape machine to pause it. "You're missing every good line of the script," he barked at me. And I had no idea what he was talking about because script, I hadn't started writing yet. Dave rewound the tape and he played it at normal speed, and he hit pause as it hit a shot of a woman picking up a shoe, inspecting it, putting it down and walking away. "Not every looker was a buyer" is your opening line, Dave said, and then he returned to his seat at the top of the news desk. Dave was schooling me in what's known as writing to pictures, which is choosing your words to complement but not describe the images that you see on the screen, as opposed to what we call wallpapering, which is you just write whatever you want and then you throw on whatever pictures you like. And it's a tool that I've used at work thousands of times since. That wasn't my first lesson in how to communicate properly on television, and it was certainly far from the last. Often it was the camera operators with whom I filmed stories, or the editors sitting in darkened suites afterwards who would explain what I could have done better. I needed more shots like this, I should have asked that, my voice would sound less forced if I relaxed. One of the more nerve-shredding experiences was when the Queensland ABC News director at the time, and Kate will attest to how nerve-shredding he could be, John Cameron, would occasionally replace the line-up producer on the desk so he could personally sub-edit the reporters' scripts. And he was known for his frank feedback, sometimes brutal, always spot on, about flabby writing and poor structure. And he was no stranger to the early morning phone call either, to let you know that he had heard you on the previous evening's news say the word ceremony as the Americanised ceremony, and he would not care to hear that repeated ever again. Those formative experiences still inform my values as a journalist, because if a journalist doesn't care about using the best shots or actually using the right pronunciation, how can a viewer trust that they care about getting the basic facts right, not to mention things like fairness and balance? I learned a lot too as a junior reporter by watching my competitors in the field, and particularly the way that the reporters in the Queensland Press Gallery in the 1990s would grill the Premier. And the lesson that stayed with me forever is that hardworking Australians pay politicians salaries, and so journalists shouldn't be afraid to ask them tough questions and hold them to account on behalf of the viewer at home. This learning from colleagues on the job has continued no matter how experienced I've become. When I was Washington correspondent in the early 2000s, every day I'd read the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, and immersion in that kind of blue ribbon journalism every day taught me a lot about clear writing and thorough investigation and how to find new angles on stories. When I was on Lateline from 2007 onwards, watching the urbane and yet rigorous way that my colleague Tony Jones would interview people helped me to find my own style. Studying the way that Helen Garner writes non-fiction and unpicking her minimalist writing style and the way she dissects issues has given me a goal for my own books. And so the years have flown by, and now I spend a fair bit of my time at work working with younger reporters and coaching them through things. And I've discovered to my delight that learning is a two-way street, and that I learn as much from young producers and reporters as I hope that they might pick up from me, because they know so much more than I do about the latest technology and new storytelling techniques and how to best adapt material for different platforms. They bring new perspectives on issues and events because of their age and life experience. And so I love being assigned to work with journalists in their 20s, because even though I've heard all the cliches about, pampered people who want to knock off work so they can make it to their yoga class, I have not found that at all. I've found them to be the exact opposite, actually. The 20-somethings I've worked with have really inspired me with their creativity and empathy and work ethic. So that's kind of how I've learnt what I do. And then in this book, I've gone and spoken to others about how they've learnt about how they communicate and how they tell stories. And so let me condense for you the 5 lessons that I've picked up researching and writing Storytellers. What I did was interviewed more than 30 media professionals, and many of them are household names. And between them, they have hundreds of years of experience covering some of the biggest stories of the past 50 years. You could fill a garage with their collected awards. Laurie Oakes and Chris Reason and Mark Burrows, Tracy Grimshaw, like you name it, Kate McClymont. But by no means are they the definitive list of Australia's best, because the choice of who to include was subjective and limited by space and a desire to include diverse experience. I wanted voices from lots of different types of media, from public broadcasting to commercial television to tabloid newspapers, digital entrepreneurs, serious investigative journalists, old school newspaper hounds, brilliant camera operators. And each of them offers their insights on telling stories based from their own experience, nothing more, nothing less. And so that means, of course, their views might be sometimes contradictory and open to interpretation. So what that means is, when I'm telling you the 5 things I've learned, it's not a list of universal truths or a set of rules to rigidly follow about storytelling, because there's lots of subjective ways to be a great storyteller. So my way of doing it is not necessarily the same as somebody else's. So for example, if I'm doing a piece of writing, I never start the actual writing until I've mapped out a very detailed structure, whereas other really good writers will just start writing and see what comes out. There's lots of different ways to go about it. So against that context, let me tell you the 5 essential lessons I think Storytellers offers. The first essential trait for good storytelling is curiosity. If you're not curious about the world around you, if you're not genuinely interested in what other people have to say, and if you can't leave your own judgment at the door, then it's very hard to follow a path to good communication, to finding out stories and communicating them. One of my favourite stories in Storytellers that illustrates the value of curiosity is from the News Limited journalist Samantha Maiden, talking about how she broke the story that Scott Morrison was secretly in Hawaii on holidays when Australia was in the grip of bushfires. Now, let me tell you, I'll just read for you what Sam said, because I can't actually express it better or more entertainingly than she did herself. Scott Morrison had done this weird thing where his office had called in some of the mastheads, which I blessedly wasn't involved in, and basically said to them, the PM's going on holidays. You need to keep this a secret because it's for his family. Didn't say where, didn't say he was going overseas. Now, I didn't know anything about it. Basically, I just started noticing. I was like, where the hell is he? Is Michael McCormack the acting Prime Minister? What's going on? And then there was these rumours that he was in Hawaii. His office was just so disparaging and rude to me. They were like, oh, no one cares about this. You're the only person who's interested in it. You're being a weirdo. It wasn't quite that explicit, but that was the flavour. And then I just got the shits. Some of my best stories come out of getting the shits. When I get annoyed, I'm like, right, let's go. I just become obsessive. Do I know anyone who works at the airports? Do I know anyone who works in something related to the airports? What about unions? Has anyone seen him at the airport? I started calling people who worked in airports, and eventually I found this person that reckoned Morrison had gotten on this flight on this day. I suppose I could have been a bit more cautious and tried to get more confirmation. But just the fact he was overseas, his office wasn't saying where he was, they hadn't called me back, not responding was almost like a yes. There was a bit of a moment of Thelma and Louise going over the cliff with that story, where I was like, all right, I'm just going to report that this person has sighted him going to Hawaii. But there was still a moment of me thinking, oh God, what if he's landed in Hawaii and he's flying on to somewhere else? I was just scared. But I thought, no, I think this is what's happening. This person's seen him getting on the plane. I'm strapping on my seatbelt and we are driving off the cliff. You might think that's unusual or that Sam got lucky, but I can tell you so often finding things out simply comes from paying attention and from following your natural curiosity and from just asking questions and being a bit of a sticky beak. It happens just in life generally over and over again, and it's a very major way that journalists uncover stories. The legendary Kate McClymont of 9 newspapers is another person who is just a boundless sticky beak, and she follows those instincts when she notices things. She told me the story of a school parent, a parent at a private school who rang her up, just cold called her to complain about another parent. The guy's name's Michael Williamson, the first father complained, and Kate was like, who's that? And the caller said, oh, he's the head of the Health Services Union and he's the national president of the Labor Party. And this person went on a rant about Michael Williamson and how he had 5 children at this private school and his wife, who didn't work, they both drove top-of-the-range Mercedes-Benz and they'd fly first class on holidays overseas and so on. And how is this possible? Because a union boss is meant to be on the same salary as their top-paid union member and so on and so forth. But what had really tipped this parent over the edge and caused him to ring Kate McClymont was that Michael Williamson constantly outbid him at the school auction. And so McClymont's curiosity was piqued. She went and did a company search, and it took her half an hour to discover that Michael Williamson owned a company. She then had a look at the annual report of the relevant union and found that this company was getting $1 million a year to provide a consultancy service to Michael Williamson's union. And then she went to the third-party declarations. There was no mention of the link. Long story short, she went through various other paper trails. Michael Williamson went to jail for 5 years on fraud charges. And that other dad's having a cracker now at the school auction nights. So it's not just the noticing, it's the actual following up. The second thing, and it's very closely related, is genuine listening. It's amazing in life how few people, I think, actually listen. I know because I do this myself. Someone will be talking to me and I'll be fretting about what is the next thing I'm going to say to keep the conversation going. I'll be worried that we're going to run out of things to talk about. And so that means I'm not really listening because I'm thinking myself about what I'm going to say next to avoid silence. You'll all recognise very common signs when someone's not listening to you properly. It's usually that you've just said something that they use as a springboard to then talk about themselves, or they're looking over your shoulder, or they're just on broadcast, not receive the entire time. So what is good listening? It's easier said than done, really, but the absolute key to it is paying attention to what the other person is saying and finding something in what they are saying to ask about. And often it can be a very simple question. Why? How did that happen? What happened next? Or sometimes even just a statement. That must have been hard. People will usually talk about whatever's of most interest to them. And I've noticed that in my career very often, people must often not be listened to properly because when they come across somebody who is genuinely interested in them, they really open up. When you listen to somebody in that genuine kind of way, they will tell you about things they might otherwise not have gotten to. When I was writing my earlier book, Any Ordinary Day, which is about the way any of us can find our life upturned in an instant by a blindside and how we come to terms with the fact that that's the reality of life, I was often interviewing people, and this was the case on 732, where they'd had something really awful happen in their lives. You have to listen very carefully to somebody if you're talking to someone that's had something bad happen to them. You can't, it's almost like sacred ground. You can't just barrel in and say, oh, this is like the time that my father died, or, you just cannot speak like that. It has to be about them if you're listening correctly. One of the people that I interviewed for Any Ordinary Day was this beautiful man called Walter Mikac, who had lost his wife and 2 little girls in the Port Arthur massacre. And I was speaking to him about 20 years after it happened. And we were talking about the way that friends had responded to him in the immediate aftermath in the weeks afterwards. And in some cases, good friends, simply disappeared because they just did not know what to say to him and they feared that they would make it worse. And Walter said to me that people in the town would sometimes see his car parked outside the local pharmacy because he was the town pharmacist, and they would think that he had killed himself because the car would be there all night, and they would think, well, he's got the means to kill himself, why wouldn't he kill himself? Now, I would never ask somebody out of the blue why they hadn't killed themselves when their family had died. It just would be grossly inhumane and inappropriate. But because I was listening closely, and Walter was the person driving the conversation, and he had raised that people were speculating that, it meant that I could gently follow up and say, had you ever thought about that? And Walter said, of course I had, of course I thought about it, but I couldn't do it to my parents because they'd already suffered enough loss. Walter wouldn't have talked about that to someone that wasn't properly listening to what he had to say. At the other end of that scale, from tragedy to exuberance, when amazing things happen, I think about an interview that I did down the road at the MCG with the cricketer Shane Warne. Now, I honestly think as well that Warney had not been listened to very closely by a lot of interviewers because he was often treated by journalists as a bit of a buffoon. And I found this kind of baffling because I thought he was a genuinely interesting person for a few reasons. One was clearly he was one of the most amazing cricketers of all time. Two, I thought he had a really amazing ability to communicate about the game of cricket and explain it really well and kind of hold your attention with his enthusiasm about it. But also just because he was a genuine Australian cultural phenomenon in the way that almost nobody is at that level. Maybe Paul Hogan or Kylie Minogue or Barry Humphries. There's hardly anyone in that kind of rarefied level. And so the interview, I wanted Shane to see that I was taking him seriously. And so the interview started talking about sports psychology. And Shane, I'd watched a lot of Shane's wickets, like the Best of Warne on YouTube and so forth, and we were talking about that. And I like to think that once he saw that he wasn't being judged, he then kind of relaxed and opened up. And then he got talking about his personal life. And he was saying, he got to talking about, I don't want to get together with somebody who has got kids because I've already raised my own kids and I don't want to have to raise somebody else's kids. But if I end up dating somebody who hasn't had kids yet, then they might want to have kids and I just don't really want to have more kids either of my own. And so it was so personal. I was thinking the natural human response would have been, it felt like we were at a pub having a chat, and the natural human response would have been to pat him on the arm and go, Shane, mate, just stop overthinking it. It's fine. Just relax. It's okay. But because it was an interview, I was thinking, oh God, what am I going to ask him at the end of this? I just don't know what to say. And so as I was fumbling for the next question, I said, so do you ever worry? And before I could even finish the sentence, he said, whether I'll meet anyone at all the time. And then he was off going again. So curiosity, proper listening. The third thing I think most top-level storytellers have in common is going the extra mile. And people who are really driven by curiosity often can't let go of something that they want to get to the bottom of or find out. In my career, one of my colleagues who I've found the most like this is Chris Reason, who's a news reporter at Channel 7. He's really an absolutely extraordinary television news reporter. He never phones it in. He's so competitive. Rezo told me about covering the Thai cave rescue in 2018. He and his cameraman had been there for days. They were running on fumes. All the world's media was there, hundreds of people. They'd been pushed back a long way from the caves, nowhere near them at all, nowhere near the action. Finally, this amazing news comes through. Oh my goodness, every last kid has been rescued, and they come out. And so everyone's exhausted. They do their last live cross. They file their last package. And then Rezo says to his cameraman, look, I'm exhausted. You're exhausted. I bet all the cops in the military are exhausted too, and they've probably gone home. And I bet you they're not guarding the perimeter around the cave anymore. Let's go and have a look. Now, of course, the cameraman wanted to throttle him. But they jump in the car. First roadblock, deserted. Second roadblock, soldier there, head on the desk, fast asleep. They just keep going. They get to the mouth of the cave, and they go in and they get a look at exactly where it all unfolded. Of all the hundreds of journalists that were there for all that time, only 4 actually took the time to go and have a look in the cave. Another person with whom I've worked a lot who's also dedicated to going the extra mile is the cameraman. He's currently on Four Corners, Louis Eriglu. You'll see his name in the credit of Four Corners all the time. He's super experienced foreign correspondent, just every major war zone for the past 20 or so years. He's really a world-class shooter. A classic of how he operates. Four Corners was doing a story not that long ago where they were shooting in Hawke's Nest, which is on the New South Wales coast. And they were there for 7 days and they needed 1 dawn shot. And Louis got it on the first day. And knowing Louis, that would have been a really, really beautiful dawn shot. But he went every single day and got a different dawn shot. Partly it's because you never know what you might get on any given day. Maybe a surfer might cut through the shot on any particular day, and that's a really brilliant dawn shot. Or maybe the weather's different, and so maybe it's stormy, and that perhaps might suit what the reporter's writing in the script to have something that looks like that. As you know, Dave English said to me, writing to complement the pictures and so forth. But Louis also said that whenever he's out with the camera, people always want to stop and have a chat. So he'd be at the beach and people would say, "Oh, g'day, mate, what are you doing?" And he'd say, "Oh, I'm here doing a story for Four Corners. I'm just trying to get a nice dawn shot." And they'd say, "Oh, you know where you should go, up around the corner to the point, because the nippers do their training around there. You'll be able to get a wonderful shot looking back," and so forth. And so that connection, or sometimes they'd even give like an editorial tip that he could pass on to the journalist. So that combination of curiosity and going the extra mile allows him to tell a far richer story. Curiosity, listening, going the extra mile. The fourth trait that many great storytellers share is empathy. One of the biggest barriers to making a genuine connection with any other human being is to go into the conversation or the interaction with a judgmental mindset. Here's what I think, and if you disagree, not only are you wrong, you're a bad person. Nothing will give you a poorer experience of the world and of life than going through it with that kind of attitude. Because none of us are stupid. We all know when someone's got that kind of attitude towards us, and it doesn't exactly make us feel like being open or vulnerable with them. The primary reason, of course, to be empathetic is because you're a person, and so surely the bare minimum you owe another person is to respect their experience and their views. But again, you would also be amazed how much people will open up to you and trust you when they sense that you genuinely are empathetic. Like Louis Eriglu, Renee Nawataga is an incredible visual storyteller. She's a photographer. And like Louis, she can do an incredibly diverse array of stuff, from portrait photography to what we call spot news, when you're out in the field and you may be shooting a protest or something like that, disasters, war zones. She's done all of it. In 2004, she was assigned to the Boxing Day tsunami in Indonesia, which was just an absolute hell of an assignment for anyone on it, and it was beyond horrific for the people who lived there. She went to this local hospital, and there was a man who was sitting there extremely distraught, and so she put the camera down and just went to sit with him for a while to check if he was okay, and then he told her that his daughter had died and that they were waiting to be able to take the daughter home, and she just sat with him and didn't ask anything. She just accompanied him. And then they got talking, and he asked why she was there, and she said she was a photographer, and he invited her, "Would you come back home to our house with us when we take our daughter home, and be with us when we embalm her and have her funeral and so forth, and say goodbye to her?" And I said to Renee, my God, like the trust involved in that, to invite a stranger into your home in such an incredibly intimate and tragic moment. And I said to Renee, why do you think that they let you do that? And Renee said she thought they just genuinely wanted her there because they wanted it documented that their daughter had lived and that it mattered, that even in a disaster that had claimed so many lives, that their individual daughter mattered. It's an incredible responsibility and honour to be invited by somebody to be present for a moment like that, and you owe them your empathy. The fifth and final lesson, curiosity, going the extra mile, listening, empathy. The last thing is genuinely caring about what you do and the story that you're telling and the connections that you're making. Of course, it's so much harder to do all the things I'm talking about, to listen well and be curious and open-minded and so forth, if you're not really genuinely interested in what you're doing. But one thing I have learnt, though, in my career is that sometimes the act of listening makes you genuinely interested in something that you just never thought you would get interested in. So I found that a personal shock, actually, when I was writing my first book, Detainee 002, that I became fascinated in the history of military law and how military law differs from regular law. And then when I was researching Any Ordinary Day, I became fascinated by probability and statistics. But it does help, of course, if you're starting from a position of genuine interest. The person I know in my field who's the most engaged in what's going on around her at any given time is my ABC colleague, Lisa Miller. It doesn't matter if she's at work or on the clock or not. If she sees a police car at the end of a street, she's down there with her phone, she's been a sticky beak, she's asking everyone what's going on, what happened. We were down in Mornington Peninsula yesterday because I was doing a book event down there last night, and we stopped at a bakery to get a sausage roll for lunch, and we were talking about imagine if you ran a country bakery, do you think you could do that? Could you throw in journalism to do that? And I said, well, you've got to get up super early if you're a baker. Then when we left, she goes inside and I thought she's in there buying a brownie or something, but then I hear her, she's just grilling the baker about, what time do you have to come to work? And then she comes back out, well, this guy, he doesn't have to come in at 3 a.m. because he does sourdough. You don't have to come in at 3 a.m. when you do sourdough. You think I'm exaggerating, but you're not. I'm not. She hosts an ABC show called Mustard Dogs, and she's writing a companion book to the next series, and she pays for her own airfares all around the place and uses up her own time to go to various dog shows because she just is now interested in dogs and she knows it'll make her book better and she'll be able to tell a more complete story. One time she was coming to visit me at my house in Sydney and she got my address wrong. She had my old address, not my current address. She's always pathologically on time. And so she was supposed to be at my house at 5 o'clock and 5 o'clock passed and then 5:15 passed. And I was starting to get quite worried. And then it was 20 past 5. She rings me and she goes, oh, Salesy, I went to your old address, but Dorothy was there who bought your house. And so I went in and had a cup of tea with her. And now I don't have any time to come to your house. See you next time I'm in Sydney. So that is someone that you want in your newsroom because they are going to find out information. Now, all of these things I'm talking about, of course, they're the keys to good journalism, but I think that they would make anyone in any workplace or in any life a better storyteller, whether you're writing something down or whether you're telling somebody something. A person who has empathy, curiosity, who listens, who's genuinely curious about the world, they're not just qualities that make good journalists, I think they're qualities that make good people. And so I think it's worth thinking about them and applying them to whatever you do in life, whether it's being a more engaged mum or a CEO who's better at communicating with their staff, or in the case of someone like me, becoming better at journalism. Now, I'm going to invite Elias to come up. I'm really thrilled that Elias was able to do this tonight because he's one of the great upcoming talents at the ABC, and I was lucky enough to get to work with him at 7:30, and so I was really thrilled when he said that he'd be able to come and do this. So let me invite him to come up and we'll carry on the conversation.
Hey, Leigh.
Hey.
How you doing?
Good.
Listening to you just then, it reminded me of a thing that Christopher Hitchens once said to his students, which is, if you can write, you can talk, but how many people can actually talk? And so, do you feel storytelling, for example, is something innate within us, or is it something that can be developed?
Some people definitely have a better and a natural knack at it. Like my father was a very funny man and he just had the knack of telling a good story. And then, as I mentioned, other people don't. But there are certain things that you can do. One of the tools I use in whether I'm writing a 1-minute news story or a book is I ask myself, what is this about? And so say, for example, the anecdote that I just told about Lisa Miller not coming to my house. Well, what is that anecdote about? The funny bit is that she was meant to come to my house, she got talking to some stranger and then she didn't show up. It doesn't really matter what was she doing in Sydney or how long have I known her for or whatever. It goes to what Helen Garner said about what is the correct point at which to tell that anecdote. And so I think sometimes stopping and thinking and asking yourself, what is this about, is a good thing to ask because it stops what you're communicating, whether it's speaking or whether it's writing, it stops it from becoming bogged down in detail that people don't need to know about. And being bogged down in detail is the real enemy of good storytelling, because what happens is people just lose interest because it's too hard to keep following the detail. So I do think some people start, with an advantage, but I absolutely think that it can be learned.
And you interviewed a lot of people for this book. Did you notice that there was a consistent theme you were hearing from all of them? For example, is Laurie Oakes, does he think the same as, say, Benjamin Law? I mean, they're polar opposites, but was there a consistent theme?
So curiosity was the most consistent theme by far. Like almost every person, when I asked what was the key to them doing their job, said curiosity. But interestingly, people had seemed to land in strains of journalism that kind of fit with their personality, and you could even notice it in the way that they communicated. So the people who worked in daily news and had done so for a long time, like Chris Reason at Channel 7, Mark Burrows at Channel 9, who are very good news reporters, that they talk with a lot of brevity. They get to the point really quickly because that's what they've been trained to be able to do. Whereas Pamela Williams, who's a great investigative journalist at the Financial Review, she's talking about writing major features and she goes into great kind of detail about how she actually does that. Benjamin Law, who's a great raconteur, Trent Dalton, who's a great raconteur, Richard Fidler, they would often, when I would ask them about something, what they would reach for was a story, like an example. So they would talk about the time they met so-and-so or the time this happened. And so everything that they did would become, it's almost a little bit performative, I suppose, but where they know that they're a great raconteur and so they reach for that tool. Somebody like Laurie, who's kind of, or Niki Savva, they're very serious and they're interested, I guess, in process and why things happen and how things work. That also comes through in the way that they would communicate. And then the visual storytellers, that they are some of the people that are the most interesting to me, like the photographers and the camera operators, because that's a really different skill set to what I've got. So Louis, for example, to take Louis as the example, I've got verbal or sort of written intelligence. I can identify a good shot when I see it, if I'm going through material that I've been sent for a story. But if I was, say, in this room, I find it hard to identify what would a nice looking shot in this room be. Where if Louis is here, he'll give you a series of shots of this room and it'll look absolutely amazing. And so I find that fascinating to hear about how those people do what they do. To give you an example, there's a walk in Sydney called the Bay Run that Louis and I were doing one day, and we were talking about lighting and how lighting is a very hard skill and how much difference it makes when you have someone that knows how to light and how you can create mood really amazingly with lighting. And Louis, I was asking him about when you're in the field and you can't control the lighting, how do you what do you do? And he went, well, you just work with what's available. And he grabbed me by the shoulders and he went, look, and he pointed over there at some trees and he said, happy trees. And then he spun me around 180 degrees, pointed to some trees behind us and went, sad trees. And the difference was the trees in front of us had the sun landing on them. So they were well lit and they looked kind of bright and there was no real shadows. It was kind of even and you could see the colour really well. And then when he spun me around the other way, because the sun was behind us, the trees, when we looked backwards, were backlit. And so they were when you looked at them, they were much darker and there were much more shadows and the light was coming through in shafts. And so they really did look like happy trees and sad trees. Now, I was just walking along, having a chat. I was not noticing were the trees happy or sad. But somebody with visual intelligence is just viewing the world in an entirely different way. And people who use those skills to tell stories, they'll see, I think the political photographers in Canberra do this amazingly, actually, where they can get, a shot of somebody's face in a particular expression or somebody's tie being askew or something of that ilk, Julie Bishop's red shoes in a sea of men's shoes, and they just can tell a huge story in one image, and I think that's an incredible skill.
Talking about Louis, though, I know him as well. He's a bit crazy, so there's got to be a bit of that in there as well.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of people who are the kind of personalities that can do assignments that involve a lot of risk, and I would say I'm not really one of them. I've not done much war zone. I've done no war zone reporting and I've done limited disaster zone reporting. They have to have a degree of where they will be willing to push the line, push the envelope and take risk. And what you have to have is where they know where the line is. And that's where someone like Louis, he'll really push the line, but he knows kind of, where it is. It's also, I think, one of the things I'm big on in newsrooms is having people who come from all sorts of diverse socio-economic backgrounds. Because Louis grew up in Western Sydney, was from a migrant Turkish family who came to Australia when he was a child. He didn't do particularly well at school, but he's got what I would call serious street smarts, and he relates to people extremely well, and he can talk to kind of anyone. And so things like, if you're in a major pack of people outside a court case and it's a massive story and everyone's trying to get the front head-on shot of the person as they come out, 100% I back Louis Eriglu to get that shot. He will get that. He just can elbow his way into the middle of something. Now, I don't know if that's because, he's a rugby league fan or what he brings to it, but it's just, I think it's a form of like confidence that comes from having street smarts.
Yeah. And it's interesting you mention empathy as well as a key factor in being a good storyteller, because it's often a criticism of journalists, but even, say, filmmakers. People that made films after 9/11 were accused of being insensitive. So, or any other, natural disaster or incident that had happened in real life. So, again, it's interesting that you found a lot of the people you interviewed had empathy.
And often they had thought about or kept in touch with people for a long time who they had reported on because they wanted to make sure, they were okay. There's certainly plenty of heartless, vulture sort of journos out there. It's something that I often say to people, if people ever think about talking to the media, you've got to do your due diligence on who you're talking to make sure you're talking to someone who is empathetic and does have a good record and can be trusted and so forth. And so, I think it's... Anyone can get a kind of one-off story and not have empathy, but if you want to keep getting stories and you want to have a good reputation, you basically can't treat people as just a kind of commodity. Tracy Grimshaw makes the point that a lot of journos talk about, I did my story on blah, blah, blah. She's like, it's never my story, it's their story. It's the person who lived its story.
I remember one of the first times I ever met you, you mentioned a very kind of seminal moment in your reporting career at Hurricane Katrina.
Oh, yeah.
And could you maybe fill the audience in on...
Yeah, that was... When I look back over my own career about times I've made mistakes, they're usually things to do with a failure of empathy or being closed-minded about something. And so Hurricane Katrina, it was when I was Washington correspondent. I think I was about 30, so I was really old enough to know better. And we were at New Orleans airport where... I don't know if everyone remembers the detail of the story, but it was this just absolutely gigantic disaster, and the US government response was very, very slow, and people had been left without, like many people, water, sanitation, food, shelter, and so forth for days. And so finally, the airport had become this kind of evacuation centre, and so we were there. And I was trying to gather material to file for the radio show AM. And I didn't quite have enough yet to make a package, and the deadline's getting closer, and I'm thinking, okay, I just need one more thing. And so I started interviewing this grandmother. She had a group of kids with her, 4 or 5 kids. And she was really upset, and she was talking about all the people she couldn't find from the family and so forth. She didn't know what was going on. And I was thinking, I just need like 30 more seconds from her and I've got the whole story. And what I took to be her grandson, who was about 10, said in a quiet voice, "That's enough." And I knew I didn't have enough for the story. And I thought, I just got to ask one more question. I asked one more question, and then he said more loudly, "That's enough." And it causes me such shame to look back and go, oh my God, a 10-year-old had to tell me that enough was enough when his grandmother was crying. And so that's the kind of mistake now, with the benefit of more experience, that I wouldn't make. I shouldn't have made it at the time. I remember when I was really young, like 21 or 22, another story that really stuck with me, going to a property in central Queensland, just outside of Mergen, and it was a farmer who was being charged. We had gone on a small RSPCA plane, and they were confiscating cattle, and he was being charged with animal cruelty and so forth because the cattle were all really starving. And I was appalled by the state of the cattle. It was very distressing to see them. But I think I just was so appalled by the state of the cattle that I didn't kind of stop to think, well, it's a possibility that this man doesn't want to treat his cattle like this. Maybe he's starving. Maybe the whole family's starving. And I didn't really have the, empathy or the ability to look past my own judgment to see that maybe there was a broader story at play. And so often when I've looked back at things where I think I've got them wrong, it's to do with being focused on what I needed or my own opinion about something, rather than trying to approach it with a genuine mindset of curiosity. Like, why are these animals starving?
And you talk about, there are vulture journos out there. Is that sort of a lesson for the industry in general that I think, do we need to take that on board more? Is there enough empathy in the
100%.
industry?
There's massive trust issues in the media broadly. And I think, sadly, that we've done lots of things that have invited that. This is something I was writing about in 2007 in my book On Doubt, which was my anxiety about the kind of blending of fact and opinion, and that, we were starting to see then media organisations like Fox News come up that were just unapologetically coming from a certain ideological position. And now I just think, oh my God, that was like a golden era of kind of fair and balanced journalism, like given the way that it's trended. And so that really worries me. And so I think that affects people's trust. And so, when stories come out that, half a story got told here, or this person says they were misrepresented or so forth, if it turns out to be correct that they were misrepresented, that chips away, at people's trust. The other thing that chips away at people's trust is if media reporting doesn't kind of represent the reality of their lives. And so, for example, things, you often in your own life, you might have experience of something that can be kind of invisible to people if they're not directly involved in that world. So say, for example, if you have a chronic illness or you care for someone with a chronic illness, you might be at hospital often, or you might be calling on services and you realise, oh my God, this is just insane. Like, it's a 6-month waiting list to get assistance, for mental health, or you can only get 4 speech therapy appointments and then you've got to pay for it yourself. And if you can't pay for it yourself, then, wow, you just don't get them. And so if those kind of things, say, for example, are just invisible in the media, then people feel like, well, they're not talking about things that are relevant to my, own everyday life. And again, that's why I think diversity in newsrooms is very important. So I view it as you're trying to minimise the number of blind spots in your newsroom. Because if everyone just went to an inner city private school in Sydney or Melbourne, well, you're going to miss a heck of a lot of stories. So you want to try and have as many bases covered as you can, so you're getting a vast array of stories from the community.
And have you, over the years, seen an erosion in storytelling journalism, not just through, say, there just being the volume, there just being less media out there, but also governments now preferring to go through their own channels rather than, using a journalist?
That's definitely tricky, and that makes things hard for journalists because of the erosion, I guess, of the profitability of the media model because of the, since the arrival of the internet. It means there's fewer journalists to cover more, sources of information. And so, the fact that, say, a politician can just put a message on Facebook and sort of say really whatever they like and bypass media is challenging. Or they can choose to, with certain journos having staked out ideological positions, they can just front up to somebody who's kind of a friendly journo, and so they can say, well, I put myself up for an interview, but it's actually someone who's kind of pretty friendly and not impartial. And so I think that is that has become a bigger challenge, all the time. And of course, politicians, businesses and so forth, they're very, very well resourced with media advisors. And so they might have an army of people who counsel them on how to avoid answering questions about this, or how to conceal that information, or how to duck this issue. And so that has become, over the course of my career, an increasing challenge. And I always say to young journos, you've got to try to get past the gatekeepers all the time. Like having people's direct mobile numbers and being able to actually get directly to them is very key.
Well, speaking of that, one of the last times I remember seeing you down in Melbourne was, and it's funny, you talk about curiosity, you're one of the most curious people I've ever met, because when it comes to politicians who would refuse to do interviews on the show, you would just rock up to their press conferences and barrel them with questions that you wouldn't be able to ask them on the show. And memorably, when you came down to Melbourne, I think you were down here coincidentally, but
yeah, I was.
You rocked up to a Daniel Andrews press conference. And is that just that curiosity? You just need to be there, you need to ask the questions?
Yeah, and I mean, I'd done it, we did it once with George Pell when he wouldn't come on. I did it another time with Tony Abbott. And you couldn't, if you did it all the time, people would expect it, and so then it becomes a less useful tool. But when it's just unexpected and out of the blue, it can be kind of useful. And so that was, I just happened to be in Melbourne. We'd been trying to get him for an interview for a long time. And there was just really very basic questions to be asked. And so I think that's the thing too in a press conference environment. It's one of the things I asked Laurie Oakes about in this book. is a good question in a press conference different to a good question in an interview situation? And the answer is not really, but because the reality is, whether it's in the studio or whether it's a press conference, what you're there for is to ask what the average member of the public at home, as I said, might like to hear asked. And so whoever's, press conference I was at, or whoever was on the show, what I'd always be thinking is, well, what are viewers writing to me about? What are people saying to me on social media? What am I observing with my own eyes? What is the politician saying, and does it back the material that's coming out of the Federal Health Department, out of the Centres for Disease Control, out of the Bureau of Statistics, whatever? Testing what people in power are saying against, objective reality is an important I still believe in objective reality, in fact, and I think that's a really, in a job like hosting 7:30, I think that's your kind of core responsibility.
And in terms of your interviewing, it's one of the things you're most well known for. When you're, say, approaching an interview with Shane Warne, do you war game it differently? You obviously do, but how would you war game it differently to, say, interviewing, your famous interviews with Scott Morrison or, senior politicians?
So it's a really different skill, but they're both hard in their own ways. So with a politician and the Prime Minister, I would always have a running file going, because you can't really cram, and you'd often get very little notice that you had them. So I'd have a running file going, and then when I knew that I had them, I'd think, okay, what are the issues? And again, I would always try to pull it back to, what does the person at home most want to know about at the moment? And then I would think that through very carefully, structure an interview. Part of it would be writing down questions, but also, as I said, a good communication is about listening. And so you'd go out there with your kind of security blanket of what you want to ask, but then you'd be in the moment just listening to what the other person was saying and following up. And so that kind of an interview, for a politician mostly, sometimes you're trying to gather information in a crisis, but often you're trying to pin them down on something and get accountability. So really you're trying to kind of pin them. Whereas with a celebrity, you want the opposite. You want them to be expansive and kind of to open up. The biggest challenge with a celebrity, particularly really famous ones, is they've been interviewed so often, they're bored by it and they've been asked everything. And so the real challenge with those people is to try to find a way to make a genuine human connection and to create rapport kind of out of nothing straight away. And so I would think, again, as I kind of said in the speech, the way I'd try to do it was I would often do a lot of research on celebrities, and I'd try to think, what are they interested in, or what might they talk about, so that we're communicating as human beings, not as me interviewing somebody super famous. So I remember, for example, asking Paul McCartney about, I can't remember how we got to it, but the question was, do you ever have, a lot of people have anxiety dreams. Do you ever have anxiety dreams? And he kind of laughed and he said, oh, you know what I do? I have this repetitive one where I dream that I'm at a concert and I'm playing new material and the crowd starts getting restless and I can hear that they're starting to leave, and I turn around and I panic and I say to the band, quick, play an old one, play Hey Jude, and then we start playing Hey Jude to get everyone to stop leaving. Now, it was a funny moment in the interview, because it kind of, the interview had been going fine till then, but then after that it went really great. And it was because I think it was like a human kind of moment, because it was something that everyone experiences and you can kind of relate to. And so then it just kind of settled into a really nice just chat back and forth. So you always, in those kind of celebrity interviews, you're just hoping for that moment where you start just talking like two normal people instead of a celebrity.
And you've probably found that interviewing people like Paul McCartney or Shane Warne or Dave Grohl, they're amazing storytellers as well.
Yeah, they are actually. Dave Grohl, I highly recommend his book, which actually I think his book's called Storyteller. He is actually one of those people that clearly has a natural gift at noticing anecdotes and collecting them, and then can tell them in a very entertaining kind of way. So often those people who become very, not everyone, but some very big celebrities, I think, kind of achieve their level of stardom because they are so likeable and they're so good with the anecdote telling. Michael Caine is another one, amazing storyteller and very funny and entertaining. Tom Hanks, one of the best on the planet. They just have Tom Hanks actually a very good writer as well. They just have that ability, I think, to distill, what happened on the film set on this day that was funny or entertaining, and, how can I convey that? And yeah, those people, when you interview people that can do that, what you're trying to do is stay out of the way as much as possible. You're just trying to give them a gentle underarm bowl and then let them, be entertaining.
And with the politicians, did you notice that your most worthy combatants were those great raconteurs, or the people that just really, in its almost quixotic way, just really cared about what they were doing, and they thought whatever they were saying was, even if it's bullshit, it was,
They're definitely the better interviewees. The best ones and the ones that I like the most would be with really smart people who would argue their position very articulately, and would find that intimidating. So I'm thinking back to the days of being on Lateline, actually, people like Christopher Hitchens or Jermaine Greer, those really great intellects who could come on and mount a case for something, and that you would be really on your toes trying to match them, Paul Keating or people like that, where they're very passionate about what they're arguing. And so then it becomes a really interesting back and forth kind of thing. Because one of the things I find most fun in life is having conversations like that with people where they're arguing something that's not my opinion, and that it's forcing you to think about. Jermaine Greer actually is extraordinary at this, where when you read her work, when I read her, it sets me back, because she'll say something kind of provocative and inflammatory, and you'll go, what? How can you say that? And then she'll kind of mount a case, and then sometimes she might come at it from the other way. But the whole time what it's forcing you to do is to reassess. I mean, Christopher Hitchens also brilliant at this. You'd really have to sit back and think about, what do I actually think about that? And is that right? And that I find very exhilarating. And tragically, actually, very few people in my view, these days in politics, have that art of being persuasive like that, where you hear something and you go, wow, that's actually kind of budged the needle. And I think that that's a shame, because really politics is the art supposedly of persuasion, because you're trying to persuade people to vote for you. See, I always used to think if they came onto 7:30 and they just maintained a kind of wall of sound and their goal was to stop me from, finding anything out or pinning them down, I would think, wow, what a missed opportunity, because really someone watching, you're trying to persuade them to vote for you. And if you actually took my question and addressed it using reason and logic, you might actually change someone's mind, but they often wouldn't do that.
And what about the ability to be persuaded? I think, we're in a political environment now where most people are very very stubborn and strident in their views. Is that part of, I guess, engaging in, a flowing conversation? And is that something that's missing, do you think, in discourse at the moment?
I worry about that because I think it does tie in also with social media, where it's quite easy these days to only surround yourself with information that kind of plays to your own views, or you're not really challenged very much. You can choose to consume media that only kind of affirms your view of the world. And so it's easy to kind of be in a space where you're not challenged. Now, I'm not saying that every time you listen to someone you have to come around to agreeing with them, but I think, you just kind of wonder what's the way forward if people take very, intractable positions rather than working together. It's certainly some of the feedback too that we've had, in the media, which is that there's a lot of what is called news avoidance going on at the moment, which is people are just not watching the news. And one of the reasons is they're tired of conflict. They're tired of people who just stake out positions and kind of snipe at each other. It's just tiring for people to watch. And so that's something, again, that I think politicians need to look at, and media, because it's a turn-off to people.
Do you find yourself at times, even though you've been immersed in it for so long, do you find yourself at times being like, oh, that's a bit too much?
Yeah, I'm not tied for the first time in 30 years now, this year, I'm not tied to the daily news cycle. My life has always been dictated, because I've always worked on daily news programs. It's always been dictated by what's happening in the news on any given day. And that's been actually, the only word I can use to describe it is relief, to not have to be immersed in that every day. So for example, the US, which I really love and care about a lot, I haven't really followed at all the re-emergence of Trump and what's going on over there, because I know that I'll find that distressing. I know it'll causes me anxiety when it's something I can't control. And so I'm trying to just enjoy the break from having to be in that. Another thing, actually, just speaking of anxiety, with news avoidance, one of the things that comes through is that people say, because the news, it has a bad impact on my mental well-being. And something I've been saying to people is you can watch the news and have better control over that by remembering all the time that what you're seeing on the news is the least likely thing to happen to you. That's why it's on the news, because the nature of the news is that it focuses on the aberration. So 100 helicopters might fly safely today, but the one that crashes is the one that makes the news. Now, on any given day, because of our phones and pervasive news content, we might see that one helicopter that's crashed 50 times. From research I did for Any Ordinary Day, I know that our brain doesn't process that as one helicopter that it's seen 50 times. It starts feeling like 50 helicopters. And so if the media is talking all the time about these aberrations, they start to seem like realistic things that could happen to us. And so suddenly helicopters seem like a really scary thing when they're not actually that scary. And so that's the thing, I think, to keep reminding yourself when you see a helicopter crash or a bus crash or a child that's died of the flu or whatever it might be, what you're seeing is the least likely thing to happen to you. Now, we can't not report those things, because the reason we say report the crashed helicopter is because we don't want there to be more crashed helicopters. And maybe, like a coroner does the same kind of work, perhaps there's a problem with pilot training, perhaps there's faulty helicopter parts, perhaps there's an issue with flight paths or something. So we want to make sure that the aberration is not something that's actually going to become a bit more normalised. But nonetheless, the fact it's on the news usually means it's unlikely to happen to you. So next time you see something on your news and you feel scared and you think, oh, geez, I just couldn't cope if that happened to me, it probably won't happen to you. Almost certainly it won't happen to you.
Just finally, just on your book, was there a person you interviewed where you just thought you were just completely enamoured and just fascinated by the things they had to say? Was there just one person that stands out to you, or not to put you on the spot?
I found all of them. They're all people that I admire, certain things about what they do. I must admit, Laurie Oakes, he's just such a legend. And he's, I was a kid and Laurie Oakes was on TV. So to me, it was just extraordinary that, wow, Laurie Oakes would give me his time to talk about, how he interviews and stuff. And just having someone who's so legendary at it, unpick actually how they did it. I found that, and he's actually quite a shy sort of man, Laurie. So it was I just really enjoyed getting to speak to somebody of that kind of legendary status and get the peek behind the curtains. And also it was a bit of a relief, because when he went through it, I was like, oh, that's how I do it, thank God.
Awesome. So thank you for your time, Leigh.
No, thank you, Elias. That was great. You did a great job.
Thank you. You will be signing, just pat each other on the back. You'll be signing your books after now. So if everyone could just allow Leigh to exit to the signing section. You can get your copies. So thank you very much, Leigh. If everyone could give her a round of applause.